I wasn't angry when it happened. That's the part people don't believe. I was standing by the break room counter, watching the new VP stir powdered creamer into his coffee, like it was a science experiment, when he said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, "We're done funding the old system, guy." He didn't even look at me when HR slid the paper over. I signed, handed my badge back, and walked out without a speech. By the time his coffee got cold, the dashboards were lighting up like a Christmas tree. Payment queues jammed. Reconciliation fell behind. Clients started calling. Then the first major partner pulled the plug. And before lunch, the internal estimate on the loss was already in the range of $120 million. All because they fired the one person who knew where the bodies were buried. Except the bodies were dependencies, undocumented patches, and one switch you never flip without a rollback. My name's Ethan Cole. I'm the guy companies call when they want to modernize, but they're too embarrassed to admit the old thing still pays their salaries. At Northbridge Clearing, the old thing was a settlement and reconciliation platform that had been patched for over a decade. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't trendy, but it was stable. Stable in the way a bridge is stable. Ugly steel, a lot of bolts, and zero tolerance for improvisation. And before anyone says it, I wasn't some lone wizard guarding a basement mainframe. We had a team. We had a change calendar. We had run books. I spent years turning tribal knowledge into documentation because I'd seen what happens when knowledge lives in one head. But the truth was the system tolerated the company in a way people took for granted. It processed billions quietly, every single day. It produced audit trails regulators could follow. It reconciled ugly partner files that arrived with quirks no modern platform likes to admit exist. Then they hired Caleb Rusk. He came from a place where move fast was a religion. He showed up with a tight haircut, a louder laugh, and a plan to burn down the monolith with a cloud migration he'd already named in a slide deck. Project Aurora, of course. His second day, my director, Dan Mercer, pulled me aside near the elevators. "Just help him feel confident," Dan said, like this was about emotions, not risk. I asked the only question that mattered. "Is he going to run this through normal change control?" Dan gave me the kind of smile people use when they don't want to answer. "He's ambitious." That was how it started. Caleb's first big meeting was titled Decommission Strategy. He booked a glass conference room, put Aurora timeline on the screen, and went around the table asking everyone to say what they were excited to delete. When it got to me, he grinned like we were sharing a joke. "Ethan," he said, "tell us why we're still babysitting this old system." It wasn't hostile. That would have been easier. It was casual, like the outcome was already decided. I didn't argue. I didn't posture. I opened my notebook and gave him a list. I explained settlement windows, when partner files arrived, when money moved, what happened if you missed the cutoffs. I explained the reconciliation chain, the nightly jobs that posted balances, the exception tables that had to clear before the morning reports, the regulatory extracts that were legally required to match down to the penny. I explained partner interfaces, some modern, some ancient, where standards didn't exist, only negotiated reality. And I told him about the connector, the bridge between the legacy pipeline and the partner network. It wasn't glamorous. It was the choke point. And it had behaviors that weren't in the source code because they were in the contracts. Tiny allowances for partners that had been agreed to years ago to keep the whole network stable. If you flip that without a parallel run and a rollback plan, I said, you don't get a clean failure. You get a slow mismatch. And mismatches are what burn money. Caleb listened the way some people listen to weather. Impatient, like describing reality is wasting their time. When I finished, he leaned back and smiled. "So what I'm hearing," he said, "is fear." The room went quiet in that special way, where nobody wants to be the first person to react. I kept my voice even. It's not fear, it's sequence. There are steps you can't skip. Caleb tapped his pen against the table. We're not doing museum work. After that meeting, the changes came fast. He reassigned my best engineer, Priya, to cloud enablement without asking me. He pulled my access to the production change calendar and handed it to a program manager who couldn't tell the difference between a deploy and a cutover. He scheduled meetings about my system without inviting me, then forwarded me summaries that read like a eulogy. I tried to keep it professional. I wrote what mattered down. I put risks in email. I attached run books. I made the ugly truths clean enough for executives to consume. And every time Caleb replied with the same vibe, polite annoyance, like I was making his life harder by not pretending the world was simpler. 2 weeks later, Dan asked me to stop by HR. No warning, no performance plan, no we're restructuring your role. Just a document, a polite HR rep, and Caleb sitting in the corner like he'd come to watch a movie. The HR rep said, "We're making organizational changes. Your position is being eliminated." I looked at the paper. It was the standard separation agreement. Clean language, no details, no mention of risk. I didn't plead. I didn't threaten. I asked one question. Who will be the system owner for settlement and reconciliation after today? Caleb finally looked up. His eyes were calm, almost bored. We'll distribute ownership, he said. We need builders, not caretakers. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, because I understood. To him, I wasn't a person with institutional knowledge. I was an obstacle that made his timeline look less heroic. I signed. I handed over my badge. I walked out. And as the lobby doors closed behind me, my phone buzzed with a message from Priya. He moved the cutover to next week. He's doing it as a hard switch. I stared at the screen long enough to feel the first real emotion of the day. Not sadness, not anger. Something colder. Because a hard switch without a rollback isn't bold. It's negligence with a motivational quote on top. The moment someone mocks process, I stop debating and start documenting. Systems don't fail dramatically, they fail quietly. Then the money vanishes in the reconciliation gap. If you're being pushed out right before a risky change, assume they're also pushing your warnings out of the record. I didn't know it yet, but the moment my badge stopped working, the countdown started. That first night, I didn't drink, I didn't rant, I didn't post anything. I did what I've always done when something feels wrong. I built a record. I opened my laptop and pulled every email I'd sent in the last year that contained the words risk, rollback, settlement window, partner, reconciliation, change control. I saved them as PDFs labeled by date, with the attachments intact. Not because I was planning a lawsuit, because I've watched companies rewrite history in real time. By midnight, I had a folder full of receipts that all said the same thing in different ways. Don't do a hard cutover. Run in parallel. Preserve rollback. Treat the connector like a live wire. At around 1 a.m, my phone rang. It was Priya. She didn't say hello. She just said, they moved it up. I sat up in bed. Moved what up? The cutover, she said. I could hear road noise. She was calling from her car, which meant she didn't feel safe saying this on company Wi-Fi. They're not waiting a week. They're doing it in the morning. Full switch to Aurora. I stared at the ceiling like the answer might be written there. Who approved that? Caleb, she said. He told Dan he's past the point of permission. That phrase stuck to my brain. Past the point of permission. In a clearing company. In a regulated environment. Where every material change is supposed to have an approval chain you can reconstruct years later. I kept my voice calm. Are they running parallel settlement? No. Shadow reconciliation, mirror reports? No. Rollback preserved? Priya exhaled into the phone like she was trying to keep her voice steady. They're disabling the legacy connector at the bridge. They're calling it removing dead weight. I closed my eyes. That connector wasn't dead weight. It was the part that translated messy partner reality into something the ledger could tolerate. Disabling it didn't remove complexity. It relocated complexity into penalties, refunds, and broken trust. Did you put your concerns in writing? I asked. I tried, she said. The program manager told me to stop catastrophizing. Then they moved the discussion to a meeting without notes. That was the first real injustice of it, how casual they were about erasing dissent. Not even malicious, just efficient. I got out of bed, went to my desk, and forwarded Caleb a single email thread from 2 weeks earlier. It was the one where I'd outlined, step by step, what had to be true before any cutover was safe. Validation runs, partner acceptance testing, reconciliation proof, rollback plans. I added one line at the top. This is the checklist I provided. Please confirm the items below are complete before any switchover. I hit send. 2 minutes later, an auto reply came back. This email address is no longer monitored. He'd already cut off the trail. He'd already decided there would be no clean record of what I'd warned. I called Dan Mercer. Dan answered on the second ring, and his voice was quiet in that particular way people get when they're sitting next to someone who doesn't want them talking. Ethan, he said, they're cutting over in the morning. I said, tell me that's not true. There was a pause, long enough that I could picture him looking at a wall, weighing his own survival. It's true, he said. Dan, I asked, did the risk committee sign off? Another pause. No. Did you sign off? His silence was the answer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult him. I just stated the reality he was trying not to say out loud. They're doing this without a chain of accountability. Dan's breath hit the microphone. Caleb says we'll be fine. He says your system is over-engineered paranoia. For a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The only people who call safeguards paranoia are people who have never had to explain a loss to a regulator. I did something I hadn't planned to do. I offered help. Put me on a call, I said. I'll walk everyone through the failure modes, calmly. No drama, just facts. Dan hesitated. Caleb doesn't want you involved. Of course he didn't. Involving me meant admitting the old system guy might have been right, so I changed tactics. Then send this, I said, from you, not from me. I texted Dan a short, professional statement, tight enough to paste into an email without edits. I am formally advising against a hard cutover, without parallel validation and a tested rollback plan. The connector behavior includes partner-specific allowances that are not replicated in Aurora. Proceeding without those controls, risk settlement mismatch, partner rejection, penalty exposure, and reconciliation failure. Dan read it. I could tell because the line stayed quiet too long. Then he said, I can't put that in email. I felt my stomach drop, not out of fear for them, but because that sentence tells you everything about the culture. Why? I asked, already knowing. Dan swallowed. Caleb said, keep it off email. He said we'll solve it in execution. There it was. The moment the story stops being about a technical migration and becomes about liability. I took a breath. Dan, if he's asking you to keep warnings off email, he's not managing risk. He's managing blame. Dan didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He just said, what do? I answered honestly. You protect yourself and your team. Put your objections somewhere that survives. After we hung up, I drafted a memo for myself. Not a threat, not a rant. A timeline, dates, meetings, the checklist I'd provided, the fact that access was removed, the fact that they intended to cut over without rollback. Then I emailed it to my personal attorney's inbox with the subject line, Northbridge Cutover Risk Timeline. I didn't want to use it. I just wanted it to exist. At 5 a.m, Priya texted me a single message. They're flipping it now. And a minute later, another. Monitoring board just went black. I stared at that sentence. Because when the monitoring board goes black, it's not a small issue. It's the moment a company loses visibility into money. And when you lose visibility into money, you don't just lose money. You lose trust. You lose time. You lose control. The fastest way to spot bad leadership is when they fear written records more than real failure. In regulated work, keep it off email is a red flag the size of a building. If visibility goes dark first, The damage is already moving faster than the people in charge. By mid-morning, it wasn't speculation anymore. It was numbers. Priya sent me a screenshot from the incident channel. Cropped tight, no names. Just a graph spiking the way blood pressure spikes, right before something gives out. Under it, one message. Partner rejects climbing. Settlement queue stalled. Recon lag increasing. Then another. Customer balances showing duplicate holds. I read those lines twice, slow, because I knew exactly what that meant in real life, not theoretical risk. Real people seeing money disappear, payments hanging, merchants calling, clients calling, compliance asking why the ledger didn't match yesterday. At 10:30, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered because the truth is I wanted to hear their tone. Panic has a sound. "Ethan," the voice said, "it's Caleb." He sounded like he'd swallowed a smile and replaced it with professionalism. That forced calm executives use when the room is screaming, but they need to sound like they're in control. "We need a quick consult," he said. 15 minutes. Help us understand the connector behavior. The partner side isn't responding the way the model predicted. I looked at my calendar. Empty. My house quiet. My badge dead. And I felt something surprising, not triumph, disappointment. Because the same man who called me museum work was now calling me like I was a tool he'd thrown away and expected to still function. "You fired me yesterday," I said. "We're past that," Caleb replied. Like my career was an inconvenience. "This is urgent." I kept my voice flat. "Are you asking me to take responsibility for a production incident I didn't authorize, on a system you locked me out of?" There was silence. Not long, but long enough. The kind of pause where someone is calculating whether you're useful or dangerous. "No," he said quickly. "We're not asking you to own anything. We just need context." "I can provide context under a contract," I said. "Hourly rate, scope, and written acknowledgement that I advised against a hard cutover without rollback." His breathing changed, sharp, irritated. "This is not the time to negotiate." "It is," I said, "because this is the time you'll remember later." He didn't respond. He hung up. And right after, Dan Mercer called me. Dan didn't sound irritated. He sounded frightened. "Ethan," he said, "please." That single word told me he'd finally understood. Not the technical part, the human part. The part where your name becomes the easiest object to throw at a fire to prove you did something. "What's the status?" I asked. Dan spoke fast, like he was reading from a mental checklist. "Partner penalties are triggering. 2 major clients are asking for incident reports. Treasury can't reconcile settlement. The CFO is on a call with legal. We might have to file a disclosure." I rubbed my forehead. "Who's running incident command?" "Aurora lead," Dan said. "Good guy, smart. But he doesn't know the legacy behaviors." "And Caleb?" I asked. Dan hesitated. "Caleb keeps overriding decisions. He pushed a change 30 minutes ago during the incident window." "During the incident," I repeated. "He deployed during a live severity one." Dan's voice cracked slightly. He said it was the only way. That was the moment I felt the shift inside myself, like a door clicking shut. Because now it wasn't just incompetence, it was reckless control. The most dangerous kind. The kind that makes the situation worse just to prove you're still in charge. "Dan," I said, "I need you to send me a written request for consulting support." He exhaled. "I can't. He told us not to involve you." "I'm not asking for permission," I said. "I'm asking for a record. If you want help, I need paper. And the paper has to include 2 things. That this incident was triggered by an unvalidated cutover, and that rollback options were not preserved." There was a long pause. Then Dan said quietly, "I can't put that in writing." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Then you can't afford me," I said. Harsh, yes. But it was true. Without a record, stepping back in wouldn't be helping. It would be volunteering to become the story. The story they tell when the board asks how this happened, and someone needs a name that isn't theirs. I didn't hang up angry. I hung up clear. I called my employment attorney and gave him the short version, fired the day before a high-risk cutover, warnings kept off email, incident now in progress, leadership calling for help without acknowledging responsibility. My attorney didn't sound surprised. He sounded practical. "Do not consult without a contract," he said. "Do not step into that building without written scope." Then I did the one thing I knew would survive politics. I pulled up Northbridge's governance policy, the one nobody reads until it's too late. In that policy, there was a mailbox for the audit committee. It existed for exactly this kind of situation, when executive narratives diverge from factual risk. I wrote a short memo, no insults, no emotion, just a timeline, my role and responsibilities, the checklist I provided, the dates of my advisories, the fact that I was terminated immediately prior to a scheduled high-risk cutover, the fact that team members reported a hard cutover without rollback preservation, the phrase "keep it off email" reported to me by a director, and I ended with one sentence. If requested, I am willing to provide factual testimony and documentation of prior risk advisories. Then I sent it, not to shame anyone, to anchor the truth before the story got rewritten. That afternoon, Priya texted me again. They're blaming unexpected partner behavior. I stared at that line and felt something like a cold laugh in my chest, because there was nothing unexpected about it. It was exactly what I'd warned them about. Partners weren't behaving unexpectedly. Aurora was. And now, with money stuck, clients angry and regulators sniffing around, the company was about to learn a lesson I've seen too many times. You can delete the person, you can delete the emails, but you can't delete reality. When leaders refuse a written scope during a crisis, it's not urgency, it's avoidance. A Severity 1 incident plus live changes is how small failures become existential events. If you want justice in corporate life, you don't shout. You timestamp. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. That evening, my attorney forwarded me a short note he'd received through a corporate contact. Northbridge's audit committee had convened an emergency session, not a leadership sync, not an engineering stand-up. A governance meeting, minutes, votes, liability. And then, at a little after 9, I got an email from Denise Halverson, the audit committee chair. Denise wasn't the type to write in emotion. She wrote like someone who has signed enough reports to know what words cost later. She didn't ask me to help the team. She didn't say, "We miss you." She wrote, "They believed change control was bypassed. They believed material harm occurred. They wanted an independent assessment and factual testimony of prior advisories." That was the first moment since the layoff that my pulse slowed, because it meant the story was no longer going to be written, only by the people who lit the match. My attorney and I replied with terms that were deliberately boring: hourly rate, minimum hours, written scope, indemnification, and one clause I insisted on. Northbridge had to acknowledge in writing that I advised against a hard cutover, without parallel validation and rollback preservation. Denise accepted within minutes. No haggling, no posturing. That alone told me everything. They weren't trying to buy heroics. They were trying to buy truth. The next morning, security didn't hand me a cardboard box. They handed me a visitor badge and walked me to a conference room already filled with people who looked like they hadn't slept. 2 engineers, a program manager, Dan Mercer, 1 person from compliance, and a VP from finance whose hands wouldn't stop moving, like his body was trying to outrun the numbers. The incident commander started talking fast. Partner rejects, stuck settlement, mismatched ledgers, penalty clauses, calls with legal. I listened for 5 minutes and then asked for 2 things. The change timeline, I said. Every action since cutover started. And? The incident commander asked. The approvals. Show me the chain. The program manager slid a spreadsheet across the table. It looked clean. Too clean. Rows missing. Time gaps. A perfect story. I didn't raise my voice. I just tapped the empty space between 2 timestamps. What happened here? He blinked. We streamlined documentation during the incident. Streamlined means you removed evidence, I said. The room went still. That's when the chaos became useful. People stop improvising when they realize you're not here to soothe. You're here to reconstruct. I asked for the raw logs, deployment records, access logs, and configuration history from the connector bridge. Not the summary. Not the slide deck. The Aurora lead hesitated. Some of that was cleaned up. We were trying to reduce noise. I looked at him. He wasn't malicious. He was trapped inside a bad culture. Noise is how you prove what happened, I said. If you delete noise, you delete innocence. Dan finally spoke. Voice low. Caleb told them to keep it moving. Of course he did. We spent the next 2 hours rebuilding the timeline from systems that don't care about leadership narratives. Identity logs, repository commits, the deployment pipeline history, and the configuration store. That's when I found it. A manual override pushed during the incident window, issued under Caleb's credentials. Not a planned change. Not an emergency fix approved by incident command. A direct patch to the connector rules. Applied live. Intended to force partner files through Aurora by relaxing validation. That kind of fix doesn't solve reconciliation. It breaks it in a way that looks like progress for 30 minutes, and then turns into a ledger that can't be trusted. I turned my laptop toward the room. This is the moment the losses accelerated, I said. Not the original cutover. This. The finance VP leaned in like he was reading a death certificate. Can you prove it? I pointed to the chain. Credential, timestamp, configuration delta, downstream mismatch. Yes, I said. Because the systems kept the record even when people tried not to. Dan stared at the screen. He looked physically ill. He did this himself. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even comment. I moved to the next step. Here's what we can do, I said. We stabilize, then we reconcile the truth. We rebuilt a rollback path the way you build one when the easy option was deleted. Re-enable the legacy connector in parallel, route partner files through a quarantine pipeline, reprocess corrupted batches with strict validation, and generate a reconciliation report that could survive external review. It was ugly. It was slower than Caleb's fantasy timeline, but it was real. By late afternoon, the dashboard started telling the truth again. The queue was still heavy, but it was moving. The reconciliation gap stopped widening. Partners stopped escalating every hour. And then Denise walked in with 2 committee members and 1 person from corporate security. She didn't look at the engineers first. She looked at me. "Do you have what you need?" she asked. "I have enough," I said. "Enough to stabilize, enough to document." She nodded once. "Good. We're not here to erase anything." Then she turned to Dan. "Where is Caleb?" Dan's eyes flicked toward the hallway. "He's in a call." Denise didn't change tone. "Have security revoke his access. Now. In writing. With witnesses." The program manager looked like he was about to protest, like access revocation was a social conflict instead of a control. The security lead didn't hesitate. He stepped out, made a call, and came back. "Credentials disabled," he said. A minute later, Caleb appeared in the doorway. He looked composed for half a second, until he saw Denise, security, and the room full of exhausted people who finally had proof. "What is this?" he asked, voice tight, trying to sound offended instead of frightened. Denise spoke calmly. "This is governance. Your access has been revoked. Pending investigation." Caleb's jaw flexed. "You can't do that in the middle of an incident." Denise didn't blink. "We can, and we did, because you pushed an unauthorized change during a severity. One event." Caleb looked around the room like he expected someone to defend him. Like authority is a spell that works if enough people believe. Nobody spoke. That silence wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. It was the sound of a narrative collapsing under logs. Caleb tried one last move. He looked at me. "So you're back," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Happy now?" I kept my voice flat. This isn't about happy. This is about controls. Denise stepped between us like a door closing. You will communicate through counsel, she told Caleb, and you will not contact staff directly. He stood there for a second, breathing through his nose, then turned and walked out. When the door shut, the room exhaled as if it had been holding air for 2 days. Priya texted me from somewhere down the hall. Did he really just get locked out? I answered with one word, yes. And for the first time since my badge died, I felt a clean kind of relief. Not revenge, not rage. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had finally become harder to ignore than the ego. Chaos ends when facts show up with timestamps. The most effective revenge I've ever seen is boring. Logs, approvals, and access control. If someone needs silence to lead, they were never leading, only preventing accountability. The final loss number wasn't exactly 120 million. It was lower in some areas, higher in others, depending on whether you counted partner penalties, churn risk, overtime burn, the cost of emergency credit facilities, and the deals that quietly died in conference rooms. Nobody writes about. But the exact numbers stopped mattering once one thing became undeniable. The loss wasn't bad luck. It was a direct consequence of skipping controls on purpose. Denise's committee didn't produce a dramatic announcement. There was no speech in the cafeteria. Real corporations don't do closure like that. They do it in documents. Within a week, the audit committee issued a formal report. It was dry enough to make your eyes glaze over, until you realized what it contained. A change timeline reconstructed from identity logs, undeployment records, the absence of required approvals for a high-risk cutover, the deletion of rollback configuration, the unauthorized override pushed during the incident window under Caleb's credentials, the measurable acceleration of reconciliation, mismatch, after that override, the list of prior risk advisories I had sent, dated and attached. It did what I needed it to do. It made the story uneditable. Compliance handled external disclosure the way it should have been handled from the start. Factual, prompt, with a remediation plan, clear partner communication, and an audit trail that could survive regulators who don't care about excuses. Partners didn't forgive Northbridge because they felt sorry. They eased off because the company finally spoke the language of trust, evidence, timelines, corrective action, and accountability. Dan kept his job, not because he was innocent, because he eventually cooperated. He turned over what he had. He stopped shielding Caleb. He chose the record over the relationship when it mattered. Priya got promoted. She didn't get promoted as a reward for suffering. She got promoted because she was one of the few people who stayed calm, documented risk, and didn't lie to herself about what she was watching. The Aurora lead didn't get fired either. Denise made the distinction that most leaders refuse to make. Building something new isn't the problem. Pretending controls are optional is. As for Caleb, he didn't get escorted out in handcuffs. That's not how this ends in real life. He resigned for personal reasons within 2 weeks. The board accepted the resignation, then invoked a cause review tied to policy violations. Clawback discussions started quietly. He lost access to the narrative, which was the only thing he ever truly valued. I never heard his laugh again in the hallway. I never had to. On my side, Northbridge offered me a permanent role, a title with modernization in it, a compensation package that suddenly recognized the value of the thing they'd called museum work. I declined, not out of pride, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. A company that only respects you when the building is on fire will eventually need another fire to remember your name. Instead, I took the consulting agreement Denise had signed and turned it into something cleaner. My own practice, short contracts, tight scope, paper that protects everyone, clients who understand that old system is often just code for system holding the weight. A month later, Priya and I met for coffee. She looked better, tired but steadier, like the fog had lifted. You ever think about what would have happened if you came back without a contract? She asked. I didn't even need to think. They would have made me the fix, I said, and later they would have made me the reason. Priya nodded slowly. Yeah. We sat in silence for a moment, and I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't replaying the humiliation of the layoff anymore. I was remembering the moment Denise said, calm as gravity. We're not here to erase anything. That was the real ending, not Caleb losing access, not the committee report, not the stabilized dashboard. The real ending was that the truth stayed documented. So the next person in that company wouldn't have to be sacrificed to protect someone's ego. If you're listening to this and you've ever been the old system person, the process person, the one who gets called negative because you refuse to pretend risk doesn't exist, here's what I learned the hard way. You don't win by yelling. You don't win by begging to be understood. You win by leaving a trail so clean that reality can't be rewritten. Because karma in corporate life is rarely mystical, it's procedural. The most satisfying endings aren't revenge fantasies, they're accountability with paperwork. If someone needs you only in emergencies, they don't value you, they rent you. Peace is walking away with your boundary intact and the truth still on record.